In Naruto, there's a lot of characters that we as a fandom are attracted to because they're so interesting. Characters that grow cult-like followings even though there's not a whole lot of information about them. And in no organization or part of Naruto is that more true than in the Akatsuki. It feels as though every single member of the Akatsuki does have a cult-like following to some degree. And that's because every member of the Akatsuki was painted out to be these ridiculously cool, very powerful characters. And the subject of today's video is no exception to that rule. That's because today, we're talking about Konan. You see, Konan is much more than just a member of the Akatsuki. She's one of the founding members of the Akatsuki. But she's even more than just one of the founding members of the Akatsuki. She was the only member of the Akatsuki who called Nagato by his name. On top of that, after Nagato's death, she became the leader of the Hidden Rain Village. She pushed Obito into quite literally having to cheat to stay alive in their fight. She is one of the most interesting, most underexplained people in not only Naruto, just anime as a whole. So today, we're doing a you know nothing about her. Before we get to explaining anyone, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And while you guys are clicking things, go follow my other two YouTube pages, NCGamer23, which is heating up right now. We are finally coming to the end of Subnautica, and Hammer's Collection, which actually has a brand new video out of me unboxing a life-size One Piece statue. So Konan, as we said, one of the most interesting members of not only the Akatsuki, just all of Naruto as a whole. But her story is a relatively long one, so let's start these videos as we usually do, at the beginning. First thing we know about Konan is that her family was killed during the Second Great Shinobi World War, a conflict between Konoha and the Hidden Rain Village. But it wasn't even just Konoha that the Hidden Rain Village was fighting. Unfortunately for the Rain Village, almost every single village was falling into a conflict with them. We know this because Hanzo fought people like Granny Chiyu and Mifune, the head samurai of the Land of Iron, multiple times throughout the duration of his life, implying that the majority of these conflicts happened during the Second Great Shinobi World War. We don't necessarily know why everybody was in the village hidden in the rain. Some hypothesize that the larger villages were trying to take it over, and other hypothesize that those larger villages were just marching through the Land of Rain in order to get to other larger villages for war, and that the Hidden Rain Village didn't like these larger villages coming through their land and destroying it on the way, and therefore fought back. Regardless of the politics of the Second Great Shinobi World War, though, all that truly matters is that the Hidden Rain Village was destroyed by it, and thousands upon thousands of children were left without parents, which meant a lot of kids had to raise themselves. And when children have to raise themselves, they often do it together. Fortunately for Konan, the magnetic personality and leadership of Yahiko brought her under his umbrella. And with time, Yahiko and Konan were inseparable. And then one day Konan went on a walk and discovered a dying Nagato with his dog Chibi. And in order to pay forward the gratitude that Konan had received from Yahiko and other orphans who they had in their hideout, she decided to bring in Nagato in order to save his life. You see, this is a reflection of a lot of things that we see in real life. When adults either fail at parenting or pass away, it's left up to the children. And children often keep an eye out for each other. This is exactly what happened with Yahiko, Nagato, and Konan. As time progressed, they slowly became best friends. Why the three of them were together when they ran into the Sannin. You see, the legendary Sannin at this time weren't exactly so legendary, and they were also still very young, probably in their early 20s. And they were on their way out of the Hidden Rain Village after losing horribly to Hanzo. The Sannin had actually been leading an entire platoon into the Hidden Rain Village that Hanzo had murdered, and they had just recently acquired the titles of the Sannin from Hanzo, who stated simply because they had survived their battle, they should be called the Legendary Sannin, or the Three Legendary Ninja. Now, when the Sannin came across the Ame Orphans, all three of them reacted in a different way. Orochimaru wanted to kill them to put them out of their misery. Tsunade felt bad for them, but was too scarred by the Second Great Shinobi World War to really want to do anything for them. And Jiraiya saw in them the errors of war. Jiraiya, who, as he was leaving the Hidden Rain Village, reflected in the terror and the destruction that this war had brought to this small, once peaceful country, saw the Ame Orphans as a way to clean his own mental palate. Jiraiya figured with how much war and destruction he had caused in this village, saving these orphans could be a way for him to feel better about everything that had happened. But this actually may not have happened without Konan. You see, the legendary Sannin opted to give them some food, and this food came in paper wrappers. Paper wrappers that Konan made into a flower and gave back to them as a sign of gratitude. Without this simple show of kindness, it's a possibility that Jiraiya never actually would have decided to stay. The back and forth give and take of giving food and receiving a flower humanized the Ame Orphans to the Sannin, which was quite possibly the breakthrough that Jiraiya needed in order to find motivation to stay. And so it's exactly what Jiraiya did. He decided to stay with them. You see, Jiraiya cared for the Ame Orphans a lot. Rather than being a paternal figure to all three of them, he decided to be much better suited that he just teach them how to survive in a world mired with war. Jiraiya knew that they had already had parents and that they were busy raising themselves. What they needed was a protector until they could protect themselves. So Jiraiya taught them things that they would later use in the Akatsuki. Things like Jiraiya's hop-in plank system, where in their hideout they would have a plank that had a red side and a white side. And there would be 4 of these planks, 1 for each single one of them. And if they were in their hideout, they would turn the plank to the red side, but if they were leaving their hideout, they would turn the plank to the white side. That way they would know that if somebody wasn't in the hideout, but their plank was on the red side, that they were captured. Or if somebody was in the hideout, but their plank was on the white side, that was an enemy impersonating them. And these kind of tactics were actually copy and pasted into the Akatsuki. They installed things like verbal challenges for each member of the Akatsuki in order to confirm their identity. And this is actually why Yamato's disguise as sorcery didn't work. And after Jiraiya decided that they were most likely able to protect themselves, he stepped away and went back to Konoha. Not before telling Konan that she was going to be beautiful when she grew up and to find him when she turned 18 though. Which is pedophilic, but okay. But after Jiraiya leaves, that's genuinely when Konan's story gets the most interesting. You see, after Jiraiya formed, the 3 Ame Orphans eventually formed the group, the Akatsuki. And the Akatsuki was composed of other orphans or just other shinobi from Ame. Ame being the village hidden in the rain. And they continued to use the hideout that they had used with Jiraiya. And every Akatsuki member had a hop-in plank. However, their organization grew so quickly, eventually they outgrew their hideout and they had to find a new one. However, as they were about to leave their hideout, they were attacked by 2 hidden stone ninja. And in order to escape those ninja in a non-violent fashion, they actually used the escape room that Jiraiya made for them in order to make sure that they could get out of the hideout safely. And as time progressed and the Akatsuki grew and grew and grew, Yahiko and Konan grew closer together. That was until things started to go wrong in the Akatsuki. You see, during the 3rd Great Shinobi World War, a man by the name of Madara Uchiha that we all know as Obito offered his services to the Akatsuki. Essentially, he wanted to help the Akatsuki in pursuit of their dreams. The dream, by the way, which was to stop all wars. You see, that's what I truly believe that we need to establish about the Akatsuki, and specifically about Konan. It was started by a group of orphans who were made orphans by war. From the start of their lives, they were mired with the worst of humanity. And truly, all they wanted in the beginning was to make a peaceful world. They understood that in order to get peace, you would have to get rid of some of the worst of humanity, but still, peace was the goal. Yahiko, being the cool figurehead of the Akatsuki, understood that Madara Uchiha was most likely just trying to use the Akatsuki to further his own goals. And unfortunately, he was the only member of the Akatsuki who saw that. Unfortunately, with a group that wants peace but also has an incredibly large force and is known all throughout the world, people are going to start to turn their head. And this is exactly what happened within the Hidden Rain. Hanzo, the leader of the Hidden Rain, actually wanted a very similar goal to the Akatsuki. Hanzo, just like the Ame Orphans, hated war, because he saw the destruction of his nation as a result of said war. And while he did revel in battle, he didn't want it to destroy his village. So when he identified that the Akatsuki might actually be threatening his rule as leader of Ame, he reached out to them. He wanted both Ame leadership and the Akatsuki to work together in the goal of creating a peaceful world, or at the very least, creating a peaceful Hidden Rain. However, unfortunately, Hanzo had somebody else whispering in his ear, and that was Danzo. Danzo was manipulating Hanzo into believing that the Akatsuki were a violent organization out for his power, something that Hanzo was getting more and more protective of by the day. So quite literally, the next day after he offers the Akatsuki to work with him, while Konan is out on patrol, Hanzo sends his men to abduct her. Konan is then dragged to a meeting between Hanzo and Yahiko. And in this meeting, Nagato is ordered to kill Yahiko to save Konan. You see, this is an awful situation for all involved. Nagato is in love with Konan, but also Yahiko is his best friend. And even though Nagato is by far the strongest member of the Akatsuki, he still looks up to Yahiko as a leader. Konan is in love with Yahiko, but also is very close friends with Nagato. And Yahiko doesn't want to see any of his 2 best friends die. But it was actually Konan who took initiative in the situation. Konan understood that Yahiko was key in the Akatsuki movement, and so she told them to flee without her, essentially forfeiting her life in order for the movement of the Akatsuki to continue. An incredibly brave and bold thing to do. However, Yahiko wouldn't allow it. Instead, Yahiko threw himself onto the blade that Nagato was holding and killed himself. Nagato then flew into a fit of rage and killed all of Hanzo's subordinates and the Anbu that were there. And this is genuinely where things get very tough for the Akatsuki. Remember when I said that Yahiko was the only person that understood that Obito was trying to use the Akatsuki to further his own goals? Well, unfortunately, Nagato truly didn't understand that. And so the first thing that he did as the leader of the Akatsuki was to go to Obito and accept his offer. And this is when the Akatsuki entered their phase of the ends justify the means. You see, at this point, the Akatsuki essentially became mercenary. They were hired out by groups in order to do mercenary acts, claiming it was a way to get funding for their long-term goals. The long-term goal still being the end of all war, but through the Eye of the Moon plan. But in order to start this plan, something else also needed to happen. The Akatsuki needed to control Ame. So Nagato started a civil war in the Hidden Rain village in order to overthrow the Ame leadership, specifically Hanzo, and he used Konan as his messenger for this. Essentially, Konan was sent out into the village to spread the message to all of the villagers of Ame that peace was coming through Nagato, not only for Ame, but the entire world. And with the power of the Akatsuki and Nagato himself, Nagato killed Hanzo. But Nagato and Konan didn't want all of Ame falling into chaos with the death of their longtime leader. So Konan actually assumed his identity and led Ame as Hanzo for many years, making a large majority of the decisions as they pertain to Ame's leadership. She was essentially a Kage for the rest of her life. And this is the thing that a lot of people don't understand about Konan. A lot of people assume that she was a puppet to Nagato and Yahiko, when she was the kind of level-headed person who would take the initiative to save both Yahiko and Nagato when they were frozen with fear by Hanzo, and the kind of person who cared so deeply for the furtherment of peace and the establishment of peace within Ame that she would lead it under the guise of Hanzo, essentially trying to accomplish what Hanzo wanted many years ago before he became so power hungry. And this is actually why we see so little of Konan throughout the duration of the Akatsuki arc. Her primary goals almost always lie with Ame, not the Akatsuki, and that's kind of always been the truth for her. And this is reflected even further later on in the story after Nagato's death, but we'll get there later. Truly, one of the only things we ever see her do within the Akatsuki is when she recruits Hidan. You see, the Akatsuki learns tale of an immortal within the land of hot water, and so Kakuzo and Konan are sent to the land of hot water in order to find and recruit this immortal to the Akatsuki. And so the two of them battle Hidan, and Hidan manages to destroy one of Kakuzo's hearts. And once Konan explains to Hidan that he'll be able to do all of the killing that he wants to in the Akatsuki and therefore serve as much honor to Lord Jashin as he could ever possibly want, he decides to join. But all of that doesn't truly give us a look into who Konan was as a character. Really, I believe the best look into Konan's personality is the Akatsuki Hiden book. You see, in the Akatsuki Hiden book, there's 4 chapters, and each of the chapters looks at a duo in the Akatsuki. Kakuzo and Hidan, Itachi and Kisame, so on and so forth. But Konan actually has basically an entire chapter to herself. An entire chapter that gives us an incredible look into her personality. The chapter opens with Konan looking out the window in Ame, thinking about her past with Yahiko and Nagato before things got so complicated. She's broken out of this trance by Nagato, who's speaking to her through Yahiko's body, his Devapath, and she's informed that Madara Uchiha is on his way. Madara tells Konan that apparently there's somebody within the Valley of Lies that has information about Iwa's Jinchuriki, Iwa being the hidden stone. And because the identity of Jinchurikis is usually relatively suppressed, and especially nowadays that they're being hunted down, this information is as good as gold. Nagato and Madara agree that this informant need to be interrogated and agreed to send Konan. However, when they try to send Konan, she says, no, I'm not going. I have duties to Ame and I need to stay with Nagato. And instead, she suggested that they send Hidan and Kakuzo because they were literally just there. In fact, they had destroyed the village and the informant had just barely gotten away with his life. This kind of disagreement with the two people at the top of the leadership of the Akatsuki gives us a really good look into who Konan was as a person. You see, Konan was a part of the Akatsuki. Konan genuinely never really bought into this new wave of the Akatsuki. You see, Konan had originally joined the Akatsuki because she respected and loved Yahiko and Nagato so much. However, because she respected and knew Yahiko so well, she would understand exactly what he would want. And even though Yahiko was the only person who knew that Obito was trying to use the Akatsuki to service his greater goals, Konan still knew that the current form of the Akatsuki was not what Yahiko wanted. And therefore, she readjusted her values to focusing more centrally on Ame and keeping Nagato alive. Because those are two things that Yahiko very much would want. In this sense, she shows much greater emotional security and intelligence than Nagato. But Madara cut her off and said, as a member of the Akatsuki, you have to contribute sometimes, which implies that even at the top level, Obito understands that Konan is not tapped into the Akatsuki. She actively tries to not work for it because it just simply doesn't align with her core values. Konan is a bit like a soldier who doesn't agree with the war they're in, but they continue to soldier on in order to protect the people they're in the war with. Do they necessarily disagree with the enemy? No, but they understand that if they don't soldier on in a way that's sufficient, it might affect those around them. And therefore, Konan was forced to go on the trip. And while Konan is packing for this trip, she thinks about how it's going to be a 10-day trip, and that's 10 days she'll be away from Nagato. And even though Nagato assured her that he would be fine while she was away, she heard Yahiko in her brain talking about how Nagato was so central in their plan to make everlasting peace. This was a large reason as to why Konan wanted to stay with Nagato, because he was so important to Yahiko's plan. And as she's packing, she pulls out a yellowing piece of paper from its age. It's really old. And on this piece of paper, there's a pressed flower. In the old times, people used to press flowers under rocks in order to preserve them. As she looked at this yellowing piece of paper and this flower, she sniffed it and then returned it to its hiding place. She then met with Zetsu, who was leading her to the Valley of the Lies, said goodbye to Nagato's Deva path, and headed out. And on their way from Ame to the Valley of the Lies, Konan saw a grouping of white flowers that looked a lot like the ones that she makes. And she sniffed the flowers, and their sweet scent reminded her of Yahiko. Basically, this entire chapter shows us that Yahiko is almost constantly on Konan's mind, and that to this day she still acts in what she believes would be his greatest interests. And the sweet scent of these flowers actually brought her back to a memory she had with Yahiko. The memory that they had was Konan and Yahiko heading to a village near the border of the Land of Fire. They had gone to this village in order to obtain supplies. However, this village primarily sold to Konoha ninja, who amongst ninja are incredibly rich. So all of the objects there were way too expensive for Yahiko and Konan. And as they were about to leave, Yahiko told Konan to turn around. It's at this point that Yahiko ran back to the seller. You see, the seller was selling white flowers. However, they were heavily damaged, so damaged that the seller was about to throw them out. And because he was about to throw them out, Yahiko convinced the seller to give them to him for free. Yahiko then sprinted back to Konan and presented her the white flower, telling her that it reminded him of her hair ornament, and that he wanted to give it to her because flowers were so hard to come by at Ame because of the heavy rain. It was at this point that Konan began to blush, and she accepted it. However, she was snapped out of this memory by Zetsu, who realized that she was being entranced by these flowers, so it grabbed a bouquet of them roughly and shoved it to her. Konan took the flowers and put it against her chest, right next to where her hidden pressed flower was. It's at this point that Zetsu gave her instructions on how to get to the Valley of the Lies, said he would meet her there, and then basically split. And after Zetsu leaves, she once again smells the flowers that she's put right here. And the flower's scent reminds her how after a couple of days after receiving Yahiko's flower, she decided to press it with a stone in order to preserve it, and how it hadn't come out perfect, but she still loved it. And that was the flower that she still carries with her to this day. She was then remembering, as she was admiring this freshly pressed flower in the hideout, Nagato came in. Nagato had just returned from a successful mission with Yahiko for the Akatsuki. And in order to celebrate the successful mission, they were making a meal. And as they were working to make this meal, Nagato mentioned that he wanted to see Jiraiya sensei, but only after they had accomplished their goal of ending all war. To which Konan very much agreed. She also wanted to see Jiraiya again. However, it was at this point that Nagato said something really interesting. Nagato said after all wars are ended, he wanted to have more people who were precious to him. And he said that finding more people who are precious to him is only something that Konan could accomplish, saying the line that sometimes flowers bear fruit. Essentially, what Nagato was telling Konan here is he wanted one day for them to have kids. However, at the moment, Konan didn't understand what he was talking about. But now, as she's remembering these memories, she finally understands what Nagato means. And the weight of what he said in that moment actually stops her in her tracks. Not because she's excited, but because she's hurt. Because she knew she was a flower, couldn't bear fruit. Konan, because of the kinjutsu that she used to make her body entirely made of flower, was infertile. And she realized that Nagato's end goal after the war was to share a life with her, and that unfortunately wouldn't be something that she could give him. But this is devastating. Obviously, the service of the greater goal is to stop all wars, right? But Yahiko and Nagato and Konan were still making plans for what was going to happen after they accomplished this goal. And those plans were so human, so simple. They simply wanted to bring kids into the new world that they created so that those kids would never have to experience what they experienced as children. But on top of the fact that Konan was now watching the Akatsuki become something that she knew Yahiko would never want it to be, she knew that her and Nagato would never have the life that he wanted. And that night, she fell asleep devastated. The next morning, she woke up and she smelled the flowers again, evoking even more memories, but this time, not as good memories. See, she remembered the day that Yahiko died, when she was taken by Hanzo. And even though she pled with Yahiko and Nagato to run away, they didn't. And because of that, Yahiko was killed. But as Konan sits there, she thinks that maybe also Nagato died that day. Because prior to that day, he was kind and sensitive, the kind of person who would talk about wanting kids with her in the future. But after that day, he became ruthless and uncompromising. Worst of all, was willing to work with Madara, who was distorting the Akatsuki into something that Yahiko wouldn't even recognize. And in this sense, you could almost see a level of disgust from Konan to Nagato. Obviously, she still loves him, but she understands that he's no longer the person that she grew up with. going so far as to say that the Nagato that she knows is gone. And as she continues upon her travels, she comes upon a field of white flowers. And this field of white flowers invokes so many memories that she actually sees Yahiko standing next to her, to which she admits all of her guilt. She tells Yahiko that she believes if she was the one to die, him and Nagato would have gone on to create a world of peace, and they wouldn't have been cast into this dark version of the Akatsuki they're currently living in. Konan goes on to tell Yahiko's image that after they completed their goal of world peace, they would have gone on to see Jiraiya again, and they would have mentioned her fondly and lived happily ever after. She tells Yahiko that she believes that he would have been able to steer Nagato out of this path of darkness. And it's at this point that Yahiko's image actually tells Konan that she should abandon the Akatsuki and save herself from Nagato's corruption. This couple of pages gives us the best look into Konan's personality and psyche out of anything in the entirety of Naruto lore. We understand that yes, Konan might have survived the encounter with Hanzo, but every single day she lives with survivor's guilt. She lived so that the leader of the Akatsuki and the person she loved more than anything on earth could die. Not only does she have to live with that on a personal level, she has to live with it on a professional level, fully coming to grips with the fact that Yahiko was better suited to lead the Akatsuki, and yet her being captured is the reason he's no longer around. And now, with him gone, Nagato has been cast into a dark version of himself that she doesn't even recognize, something that she feels that Yahiko would have also been able to stop. But she also understands that Yahiko would probably never tell her to abandon Nagato. Because of this, she becomes leery and realizes she's under genjutsu. And as she breaks herself out of this genjutsu, she realizes she was simply a couple of steps away from walking off a cliff. And that makes her realize she's made it to the Valley of Lies, which is protected by a large genjutsu. That's why nobody's ever found it. But once she breaks out of the genjutsu, the informant attacks her. Not being ready to fight, she flees to find a better terrain, but Yahiko's image continues to follow her. She realized that the genjutsu's ability comes from the scent of the flowers, so she casts out the flowers from her cloak. Yahiko's image still follows her, faded now. She realizes that the scent has soaked into the cloak itself, so she has to abandon that cloak as well. And still, even though her cloak was gone and the image of Yahiko was gone, his voice still followed her. So as a last resort, she took out her pressed flower, made it into a paper shuriken, and threw it at the informant. And just like that, his genjutsu was dispelled. With the genjutsu dispelled, she descended upon the informant and encased him in paper. With the genjutsu completely dispelled, she came to the realization that while she did blame herself for Yahiko's death, the genjutsu was making her blame Nagato. But she didn't blame Nagato for Yahiko's death. Nagato simply stood there with a kunai, and that's how she realized she was in genjutsu. Konan was so enraged that the informant tried to bastardize Yahiko's memory that she killed him. Not before she found out that the informant didn't know enough about the four-tailed Shinchuriki to have any meaningful information, meaning that the entire trip was a waste of time. And so she returned to the hidden range, treading on the pressed flower as she left. And Obito and Zetsu watched her as she left. You see, they were disappointed with the outcome. Obito believed that if Konan died, Nagato's hatred would grow even greater, but decided as long as Nagato was still alive, that Konan would most likely stay loyal to the Akatsuki. They had sent her on the mission to die, but through this mission, she came to a couple of key realizations. That even though she doesn't recognize the Akatsuki she's in, and neither would Yahiko, it is still her core value to protect Nagato and Ame, because that's what Yahiko would want her to do. Konan is in a very complicated world, in a very complicated situation, and in order to uncomplicate that for herself, she focuses on the things that are closest to her, which is why after Nagato's death, she goes back to Ame and becomes its de facto leader. Also, after Nagato's death, she leaves the Akatsuki because the only thing truly keeping her in the Akatsuki was the fact that she had to protect Nagato. She was much more loyal to her role as the leader of the Hidden Rain in Nagato than she ever was to the greater concept of the Akatsuki. And this made her dangerous to Obito, which is why she was almost able to kill him. Now that you're at the end of this video, think about Konan's true motivations. Think about how often she's actually had the ability to fight for those true motivations. She wanted to help build the world that Yahiko and Nagato wanted. But after Yahiko's death, she no longer could fight for that cause. So all she could fight for was to protect Nagato, because that's what Yahiko would want. But once Nagato was gone, the only thing she had left was to protect Ame. And that was something that Obito was threatening, which is why she put her all into the fight. It's why she split the ocean with paper bombs. Konan's entire life, the most important things have been taken from her. She was the last surviving member of the Ame Orphans. Yahiko's death hit her harder than it hit Nagato. She was in love with Yahiko, and yet she never lost herself after his death. She never lost herself after Nagato's death. To the very end of her life, she fought for exactly what she thought was right. And even though she might have been involved with a version of the Akatsuki she didn't agree with, she stayed there because her core values kept her there. It's not that she wanted to capture all the Jinchuriki. In fact, she never captured any of the Jinchuriki. What she truly wanted was peace for the world, and specifically Ame, and to keep those closest to her alive. And the true tragedy of Konan is that she was never able to accomplish any of these things. But at the end of the day, in terms of characters to look up to in the real life, I believe Konan is the prime example. Nagato lost himself through hatred. Madara convoluted his wants and tried to justify the ends with the means. Obito let a limited worldview guide his entire life. But Konan, in a complicated world, decided to live for simple things. And this is an important lesson for us as the viewers. When life feels incredibly complicated and overstimulating, focus on the things most important to you. If you're constantly shifting your viewpoints and your goals, you're gonna lose track of who you are. And this is unfortunately what happened to Nagato. Konan realized in her life that some things were worth fighting for, while other things can be ignored. We as humans can only accomplish so much in our short lives. And Konan knew in hers that all she wanted to truly accomplish was safety for her friends and her city. And because of that, I truly believe that she's one of the most realistic and lovable characters in the entirety of Naruto. Her story tells us to not give up on those in our lives. Never give up on the things we find most important. Hopefully this video can help you understand that that's who she was. And if you have a newfound respect for Konan as a character, guys, please tell me in the comments below. And while you're down there, please like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Listen, I'm not saying that Konan won in her fight against Obito, but Kishimoto quite literally had to create a universe-destroying ability in Izanagi in order to make sure that she didn't win.